A retired police officer was spending another Christmas alone in a snowy Oregon town, until his old K9 started barking toward an abandoned barn. Inside, he found a little girl trembling under a torn blanket, whispering, "Mama left me here." He had no idea that this child carried a letter addressed to her missing father, a soldier who'd been gone for months, and that fate was about to bring them all together under one roof. What happened that Christmas night will break your heart and make you believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The wind that night swept down from the Cascade Mountains like a restless spirit, threading through the pine forest of Evergreen Falls, a forgotten town tucked deep in the Oregon wilderness. Snow draped over every rooftop, every fence post, every silent car abandoned along the road. It was Christmas Eve, but there was no music, no laughter, only the steady hush of falling snow and the distant creak of the old wood. Inside a weathered log cabin at the edge of the town, a single light flickered through the frost-streaked window. Jack Turner, 58, sat by the weak fire, his large hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee gone cold. Once a decorated police officer, Jack had retired early after the night that stole both his wife and his peace. Years on the force had hardened his body, but the grief had hollowed him. His eyes, steel gray, heavy with sleepless nights, carried a quiet fatigue that no rest could cure. He still wore his wedding ring, dull and worn smooth, though the hand beneath it trembled slightly when the wind howled. The house was simple. Pinewood walls, a rusted stove, and shelves lined with photographs turned face down. The only sound was the steady tick of a clock that had survived longer than most of his hope. At his feet lay Ranger, an 11-year-old German shepherd, broad-shouldered and solemn. His once glossy black and tan coat had faded around the muzzle, streaked with white like early snow on dark bark. Ranger had been Jack's partner during his years on the force, a search and rescue K9 who had saved 3 lives before his retirement. Even now, his ears twitched with the old instinct, and his amber eyes never fully rested. Loyal, cautious, and protective, Ranger was the last heartbeat Jack trusted. Jack spoke softly into the dimness, as if addressing someone long gone. "Another one, huh, Mary?" he murmured. "Another Christmas." He unfolded a sheet of old paper, another letter he'd written to his late wife. Every year he wrote one. He never mailed them. He just set them on the windowsill under the candle's light, a small ritual against forgetting. But tonight, Ranger lifted his head. The dog's body stiffened, tail low, nose twitching toward the door. His ears flicked once, twice, then he let out a sharp, low bark. Jack frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ranger moved to the window, muscles coiling beneath his fur. He growled once, deep, controlled, the kind that vibrated through the floorboards. Then, without hesitation, he bolted toward the door, pressing his weight against it. Jack's pulse quickened. The old instincts stirred. The cautious, measured sense of a man who'd once followed gunfire into alleys and didn't ask questions until after. He reached for his heavy winter coat, the same one he'd worn during stakeouts years ago, and grabbed his flashlight from the counter. The door opened with a groan. The wind struck immediately, sharp, dry, full of snow. Ranger darted ahead, paws crunching through the white crust. "Ranger, slow down!" Jack shouted, but the wind carried his voice away. The night outside was pale silver, the moonlight fractured by pine branches. Jack followed the tracks, the deep, sure prints of a German shepherd leading straight toward the old barn at the property's edge. The barn hadn't been used in years. Its roof sagged, the red paint peeled away until only rusted wood remained. As Jack drew closer, Ranger stopped. He stood rigid before the barn door, ears pricked, tail stiff, his breath visible in steady bursts. Then came the sound that froze Jack's blood. A faint, broken sob carried through the cracks of the wood. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. Jack gripped the flashlight tighter, thumb brushing the switch. His voice dropped into the tone of command he hadn't used in years. "Ranger, stay close." The hinges screamed when he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, straw, and something faintly sour. Rot, perhaps, or damp earth. The beam of the flashlight cut across forgotten tools, a rusted wheelbarrow, a pile of hay that stirred faintly with the draft. Then it landed on her. In the far corner, half hidden under straw, a small figure huddled inside a torn blanket. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest. Her hair hung in limp curls over her face. When the light touched her, she flinched. Jack's throat tightened. "Hey there," he said softly. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl was no older than 7. Her skin was pale beneath streaks of dirt, her cheeks hollow, lips cracked from cold. She wore a faded pink dress, frayed at the hem and clinging damply to her thin frame. Ranger approached carefully, tail lowered, ears turned forward in quiet curiosity. He sniffed the air, then whined, a sound that carried something like sorrow. The girl stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were light hazel, frightened, distant, as though they hadn't focused on another human being in days. She tried to pull the blanket tighter, but her hands trembled too hard. Jack crouched, lowering the beam. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Her voice was a whisper, barely a breath. "Emily." "How long have you been here?" She didn't answer. She just pressed her face into her knees, murmuring something that made Jack's heart stutter. "Mama left me here." Jack exhaled, slow and heavy. He looked around. The barn empty except for old hay, one broken lamp, and a child who looked like she'd fallen out of the world. "All right, Emily," he said gently. "You're safe now. Let's get you warm." He took off his coat, wrapping it around her small shoulders. She flinched at first, but when Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, she hesitated. Then let him. The old shepherd sat beside her, eyes steady, a silent guardian. Jack lifted the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her body radiated a chilling cold that seeped through the coat, through his gloves, straight into his chest. He could feel her heartbeat. Faint, uneven. The steady rhythm of a heart monitor echoed softly in the sterile quiet of Evergreen Memorial Hospital. Snow still clung to the window ledges outside, melting into slow trickles that ran like veins across the glass. The faint scent of antiseptic and coffee lingered in the air, a smell that reminded Jack Turner of every long night he'd ever spent waiting for news he didn't want to hear. Emily lay in the hospital bed, her small body swallowed by crisp white sheets. Her breathing had steadied, but her skin still looked too pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent light. The child's tangled light brown hair framed a face that was both fragile and haunting, her lashes trembling with each flicker of memory. Ranger rested near the foot of the bed, his chin on the floor tiles, eyes fixed on her like a sentry unwilling to sleep. Nurses passing by couldn't help but smile softly. It wasn't often they saw an old K9 act as a guardian angel. Jack stood by the doorway, his large hands buried deep in his coat pockets. The exhaustion that lined his face wasn't just from the sleepless night. It was the kind that came from reliving ghosts he thought he'd buried. He had been here before, same hospital, same helplessness, when Mary, his wife, had been brought in years ago after the convenience store shooting. He'd sworn never to step foot in a hospital again unless he was the one in the bed. But promises were fickle things in the face of duty. The door opened behind him with a soft creak. A woman's voice, firm but calm, filled the room. "Jack Turner, I almost didn't believe it when they told me you were here." He turned, surprised by a voice that carried both warmth and authority. Standing there was Dr. Laura Miller, mid-40s, tall and lean with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, a few rebellious strands brushing her cheekbones. Her hazel eyes had that blend of sharp intelligence and unspoken empathy only found in those who had learned to survive heartbreak. Once upon a time, she'd been one of his police cadets, fresh-faced and idealistic. She had left the academy after her younger brother died in a car crash, a loss that had reshaped her life and driven her into medicine. "Laura," Jack said quietly, his voice rough. "Didn't expect you'd still remember an old man like me." She smiled faintly. "You don't forget the one who taught you how to read a liar's eyes." Laura walked over to Emily's bedside, checking the IV and adjusting the monitor. Her touch was gentle, precise. "She's stable now," she said after a moment. "Severe hypothermia, mild dehydration, and clear signs of emotional trauma. But she's young. Kids are resilient when given a reason to be." Jack nodded, his gaze shifting to the sleeping child. "She hasn't said much." "She doesn't trust easily," Laura replied. "She flinched when a nurse tried to change her blanket, especially around women. That kind of fear doesn't come from nowhere." Jack's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I figured as much." For a while, the two stood in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the machines. Ranger's tail thumped once on the floor, as if sensing the weight in the air. Laura knelt down and scratched the old dog behind the ears. "Still got the same partner, huh?" Jack chuckled dryly. "He's the only one who didn't retire on me." A weak sound came from the bed. Emily stirred, her small voice fragile but clear. "Ranger." The dog's ears perked instantly. He stood, padded to her bedside, and rested his head gently on the mattress. Emily's tiny hand reached out, brushing the fur between his ears, and for the first time since she'd arrived, a flicker of a smile touched her lips. Laura watched the moment with quiet awe. "Well," she said softly, "there's your reason." Jack looked at her, puzzled. "You can't save everyone, Jack," she continued, her tone gentle but firm. "You've tried your whole life and it broke you, but maybe you don't have to save everyone. Maybe you just need to save one." The words landed heavy, echoing somewhere deep inside him. He didn't answer, but the silence spoke enough. Later that evening, as snow continued to fall outside, Jack sat beside Emily's bed while Laura filled out paperwork at the nurse's station. The child had woken up again, calmer now, sipping from a cup of warm apple juice. She looked at Jack with sleepy curiosity. "Are you a sheriff?" Jack smiled faintly. "Used to be, a long time ago." She nodded as if that somehow explained everything. "Daddy's a hero too," she murmured. "He wears the green suit. He went far away to fight bad people. Mama said he was going to come home soon. But he didn't." Jack's throat tightened. "Do you know his name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Ethan. Ethan Ward." Jack recognized the name instantly. He'd seen it once, years ago, on a community board for returning soldiers. He didn't know him personally, but he remembered reading about a deployment that had gone wrong. A unit stranded overseas, communications cut off for months. Laura returned just as Emily drifted back to sleep. "You'll need to sign temporary custody papers," she said, placing a clipboard in his hands. "Child Services won't process it until morning, but you're the only one she trusts right now." Jack signed without hesitation. "I'll keep her safe," he said simply. That night, while Emily slept and Ranger kept vigil by her side, Jack stood near the window watching the snowfall bury the streets below. Laura joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one over. "Still take it black?" He nodded. They stood together for a while in silence, watching snowflakes drift through the yellow streetlight glow. Then Laura spoke again, softer this time. "You remember when I was your trainee? You told me once that fear is just memory with a pulse. I didn't understand it back then. Now I think I do." Jack smiled faintly. "You always were the smart one." When the morning light crept through the window, Emily woke to find Jack still there. She sat up slowly, looking from him to the sleeping dog. "Is Ranger your dog?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Has been for a long time." She smiled weakly. "He likes me." "That he does," Jack said. He's got good taste." A nurse came in, a middle-aged woman named Sandy, cheerful and soft-spoken, with round glasses that always slid down her nose. She checked Emily's vitals, chatting gently as she worked. "You've got strong lungs, sweetheart. You'll be running around in no time." But the moment Sandy touched her wrist, Emily flinched and hid behind Ranger. Sandy froze, startled but kind. "It's okay, honey," she said softly before stepping back. Laura exchanged a knowing glance with Jack. "See what I mean?" As the day stretched on, Jack began making calls. He still had contacts in the force, men and women who owed him favors. He started with Detective Ray Monroe, an old colleague from his Portland days, now working with the Veterans Liaison Office. Ray was in his early 60s, balding, loud, and perpetually chewing gum. "Ethan Ward," Ray said over the line. "Yeah, I remember him. Army Recon. Went missing for a while during deployment last year. Rumor was his unit got cut off in Jordan. Official word said he made it back stateside a few months ago, but no one's seen him around." "Any family listed?" Jack asked. "Just a wife, Clara Ward. Moved to Albany last year. Didn't answer follow-ups from Veterans Affairs." Jack thanked him and hung up, mind turning. Clara Ward. The name scraped something raw inside him. A chill that didn't come from the snow. That evening, when Laura returned to check on them, she found Emily sitting cross-legged on the bed, drawing clumsy pictures on a napkin with a hospital pen. Ranger sat beside her, his paw resting over the paper as if protecting her work. "She smiled again," Laura whispered. Jack nodded, watching the child's brow furrow in concentration. "She's tougher than she looks." "She reminds me of someone," Laura said with a smile. Jack looked at her confused. "You," she said simply. As night settled again over Evergreen Falls, the hospital quieted. Jack sat in the chair by Emily's bed, the faint light of the hallway spilling through the doorway. He could hear the wind outside, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like change. Ranger stirred, lifting his head, his amber eyes reflecting the soft glow. Emily's breathing evened out into sleep, her hand resting on his paw. Jack exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in years. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for tonight, the ghosts of the past had gone quiet. The blizzard came without warning, swallowing Evergreen Falls beneath a white silence. Snow blanketed the rooftops, the pine trees, the old fences that marked where one man's land ended and another's began. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the hum of generators and the muffled crunch of tires on ice. Jack Turner's truck sat idling in the hospital parking lot, its headlights glowing faintly through the falling snow like the eyes of something waiting. Inside the hospital cafeteria, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Jack sat at a small table, a thermos between his hands, watching the storm outside. Ranger rested beside his chair, chin on his paws, tail thumping occasionally as people walked by. Emily sat across from him, her legs too short to touch the floor, a hospital blanket draped over her shoulders like a cape. Her cheeks had color again, but her eyes, those deep hazel eyes, still carried the shadow of what she'd endured. She fidgeted with the zipper of a small pink backpack Laura had found among her belongings. "You sure you want to look in there?" Jack asked gently. She nodded and handed it to him. Inside were a few crayons, a half-eaten candy cane, and a folded piece of paper smudged with dirt and something darker, maybe dried tears. Jack unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was small and uneven. "Dear Dad, please come home before Christmas. Mama yells when I talk about you." He felt the words hit like a blow. The child's letters swam before his eyes. "Did you write this?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, staring down at her hands. "I wanted to mail it," she whispered, "but she said no one wants letters anymore." Laura walked in then, holding 2 cups of cocoa. Her hair was slightly damp from the snow, curls escaping from her bun. "I could smell guilt from across the hall," she teased lightly, setting a cup before Emily. "Here, extra marshmallows?" Her eyes met Jack's, and the smile faded when she saw the paper in his hands. "That's hers?" "Yeah," Jack murmured. "It's more than a letter. It's evidence." By the afternoon, Laura had taken the letter to her office to make a copy for the report. Jack joined her, standing near the window as the snow thickened outside. Her office was warm, cluttered with medical books and family photos, one of a boy about 10, smiling beside a dog. Laura caught him looking. "My brother," she said quietly. "He's the reason I left the force. I couldn't watch another family lose their kid because I hesitated." She turned back to her desk, voice steady again. "I called the county records office. Clara Ward's name showed up twice in police reports. Domestic disturbances, no charges filed, both dismissed by lack of evidence." Jack's jaw tightened. That's about to change. Later that evening, they drove through the storm toward the sheriff's department. Ranger sat upright, in the back seat, occasionally pressing his nose against the window. Inside, the office was quiet except for the sound of a space heater buzzing. A younger officer named Deputy Brian Keller greeted them. Mid-30s, pale blonde hair, fit but nervous, still knew enough to care about how he looked in uniform. "Evening, Mr. Turner. Dr. Miller." His voice cracked slightly as he took the report. "You're saying this Clara Ward might have abandoned the kid?" "Not might have," Jack said flatly. "She did." Keller hesitated, reading over the file. "I can open an investigation, but the roads are a mess. If she's out there, she's probably long gone." Jack glanced at Ranger, who was staring out the frosted window. "Not if she left something behind." That night, back at his cabin, the wind howled against the windows like a living thing. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, curled under a quilt, one hand resting on Ranger's thick fur. Jack sat at the table, the letter lying beside a cup of cooling coffee. Across from him, Laura looked over medical photos. Faded bruises on Emily's shoulders and arms, marks no one could call accidents. "If we get this to the county, they'll have to reopen the case," she said. Jack nodded. "We'll give them more than paperwork?" Just before dawn, Ranger began to stir. His ears pricked, nose twitching. Jack frowned and stood up. "What is it, boy?" The dog moved to the door, whining softly, then glanced back as if urging him to follow. The snow outside was nearly waist-deep, the world reduced to white and shadow. Ranger led the way through the trees behind the property, paws sinking into powder. The storm had softened into a whisper now, the early light gray and distant. They reached the edge of the woods where the old road curved toward the hills. There, half buried under a mound of snow, was a rusted blue pickup truck. Jack brushed off the windshield with his glove. The plate was nearly gone, but the letters CW were still visible. He opened the driver's side door. It creaked, stiff with frost. Inside, the seats were torn, and the smell of gasoline and cold earth filled the air. A single shoe lay on the floorboard, small, women's size. He reached into the glove compartment and found an empty wallet and a burned-out photograph. A woman with blonde hair holding a glass of wine, half her face missing from the tear. Clara Ward. When he got back to the cabin, Laura was awake, standing by the stove as the kettle hissed. "You were gone an hour," she said, worry softening her voice. "Found her truck," Jack said, "abandoned by the Ridge Road." Her eyes widened. "Was she—" "Gone. But she left enough behind for the sheriff." While Jack and Laura prepared their report, the morning turned brighter. Emily woke to the smell of cocoa and cinnamon. "Can I help?" she asked shyly. Laura smiled and handed her a mixing bowl. "You can." Stir. Emily climbed onto a chair, hair sticking out in soft tangles, eyes bright for the first time in days. Ranger lay beside her feet, occasionally looking up as flour dusted the air. Jack watched from the table, quietly amazed at how easily warmth could return to a place once hollow. Laura leaned against the counter, laughing when Emily tried to sneak a taste from the bowl. "Careful," she said. "Chefs lose fingers that way." The girl giggled, a sound so small and sweet that even Ranger wagged his tail in response. Outside, the snow glittered like 1,000 mirrors. For the first time since the storm began, light touched the town again. But beneath that fragile peace, Jack knew darkness still lingered. Somewhere out there, a woman was running from what she'd done, and he intended to make sure she didn't get far. For now, though, the cabin was filled with the sound of laughter, the clatter of dishes, and the faint hum of an old radio playing a Christmas tune. And as the smell of fresh-baked bread filled the air, Jack caught Laura watching him from across the room, her eyes warm, her expression soft. "You're thinking too much again," she said. "Comes with the badge," he replied, smiling faintly. "You're not wearing it anymore." He glanced at Emily and Ranger by the fire, then back at her. "Maybe I am. Just a different kind." Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, like the world exhaling. The bells of Evergreen Falls rang out through the snow, soft but clear, echoing between the mountains like a promise. The town's church glowed faintly under its wreaths and lanterns, and the streets were veiled in white. Jack Turner sat in his cabin near the window, watching the lights blur through the drifting snow. The fire behind him had burned low, casting only the quiet crackle of wood in its last embers. Ranger dozed by the hearth, his black and tan fur shimmering in the firelight. The phone rang. Its sharp sound broke the hush like a gust through a forest. Jack hesitated before picking it up. "Turner," he said, voice low. On the other end, static buzzed, followed by a man's steady voice. "Mr. Turner, this is Sergeant Miles Grant, Fort Bridge Command. You've been listed as an emergency contact for a child named Emily Ward. I believe you've been caring for her." Jack straightened in his chair. "That's right. Why?" There was a pause. The sergeant's tone softened, almost reverent. "Her father, Ethan Ward, has been found alive. He returned with his unit this morning, 9 months off the grid. He's on his way to Evergreen Memorial to see his daughter." For a long second, the only sound was the wind against the window. Jack swallowed hard. "Thank you, Sergeant." He hung up slowly, staring at the snow. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines deeper than age could carve, the kind made by loss and quiet hope. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift in the air. "Come on, old boy," Jack murmured. "Looks like Christmas came early." The drive to the hospital was slow. The snow had turned thick and heavy, falling in curtains that swallowed the headlights. Jack gripped the wheel, eyes fixed on the faint glow of town lights ahead. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, muzzle pressed to the glass, fogging it with each breath. When they reached the hospital, the parking lot was nearly empty. A string of Christmas lights flickered weakly around the entrance, half buried in snow. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of pine and cocoa. Decorations hung crookedly along the walls, paper snowflakes, silver tinsel, and a small Christmas tree in the lobby corner, its lights blinking patiently. Nurse Elena was on duty, her usual calm face framed by loose blonde curls. She looked up as Jack walked in, brushing snow off his coat. "Evening, Mr. Turner. You're just in time." Jack frowned slightly. "For what?" She smiled, eyes soft. "A reunion." She nodded toward the hallway. Room 12. Jack's boots echoed softly as he walked. The hospital felt different tonight, quieter, as if holding its breath. When he reached the door, he paused. Through the small window, he saw Emily standing beside a tiny tree placed near her bed. Her hair was brushed neatly now, tied with a red ribbon. She hummed a carol softly, hanging paper stars she had cut herself. Ranger padded to the glass, tail wagging gently. Then the door opened behind Jack. A tall man stood there, his posture rigid at first, then slowly folding under the weight of the moment. Ethan Ward looked every bit the soldier who had fought too long. Mid-30s, white, broad-shouldered but lean, his once dark hair streaked with early gray, his uniform dusted with snow. His face bore sunken eyes and faint scars that spoke of months in harsh places. He looked at Jack like someone emerging from a long dream. "You're the one who found her," he said quietly. Jack nodded. "She's been waiting." Ethan's throat worked. How is she?" "She's stronger than she knows," Jack said, "and braver than most adults I've met." Ethan tried to smile, but his lip trembled. "Thank you, sir." "You don't owe me anything," Jack replied. "Go to her." The soldier hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped inside. Jack stayed in the hallway, his hand resting lightly on Ranger's head. Inside, Emily turned at the sound of the door. For a moment, she froze. Her eyes widened as she looked up at the man in the doorway, the face she'd only seen in a faded photograph. Ethan knelt slowly, removing his gloves. "Hey, Pumpkin," he said, voice breaking. "It's me." The paper star slipped from Emily's hand. She took one step forward, then another, then ran the rest of the way. Her small arms wrapped around his neck as he caught her, holding tight. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling like wind through branches. Ethan pressed his face into her hair, eyes wet. "I'm here now. I'm not leaving again." Ranger barked softly, tail sweeping the floor, then settled beside them as if confirming the reunion was real. Laura appeared at the door, drawn by the sound. She wore a red sweater beneath her white coat, her hair loose for once, framing her gentle face. She smiled, not the practiced smile of a doctor, but one filled with quiet joy. "You picked a good night to come home," she said softly. Ethan nodded without looking up, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Jack stepped back, letting the moment breathe. He walked down the hall to the large window at the end of the corridor. Outside, snow still fell, blanketing the town in silence. Across the street, the church bells began again, steady and slow. He slipped a folded paper from his coat pocket, the last letter he had written to his wife, Margaret, years ago, but never mailed. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. "Maybe Christmas isn't about what we lost," he had written, "but what we find again." He stood there for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Then he opened the window latch just enough for the wind to slip through. The snow drifted inside, light as feathers. He let the paper go, and it danced away into the night. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Laura. "You're not staying for the celebration?" she asked gently. Jack smiled faintly. "They don't need me right now. They need each other." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You gave them that chance." Jack looked down at Ranger, whose amber eyes reflected the glow of Christmas lights from the hallway. "We both did." Laura touched his arm lightly. "Merry Christmas, Jack." He nodded. "Merry Christmas, Doc." As she turned to leave, Jack took one last glance through the window. Inside the room, Ethan and Emily were sitting together on the hospital bed. The little tree shimmered beside them, its tiny lights flickering against the frost on the window pane. Emily was showing her father how to fold paper stars. Ranger lay at their feet, eyes half closed, his tail thumping softly to the rhythm of the bells outside. The snow kept falling, gentle, unending, covering the scars of the land, softening the edges of everything it touched. Jack breathed in the cold night air, feeling something unexplainable stir in his chest. Maybe peace wasn't something found. Maybe it was built. One act of kindness at a time. He turned toward the exit, his boots leaving steady prints across the polished floor. Ranger followed, faithful as ever. And when the church bells rang midnight, Evergreen Falls glowed brighter than it had in years. Situ, morning, crept gently across Evergreen Falls. The storm had passed, leaving the town blanketed in a soft, white calm. Sunlight glimmered off the drifts, melting icicles one drop at a time. From the old Turner farm, smoke rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the blue sky. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and coffee drifted through the kitchen as laughter replaced the silence that had haunted those walls for years. Jack Turner stood by the window, his weathered hands resting on the counter, watching the frost melt from the glass. He wore his old plaid shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his face warmed by the morning light. Ranger lay on the rug near the fire, his muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half closed in contentment. Emily, now in a bright red dress Laura had found for her, danced around the small Christmas tree, humming as she hung the final ornament, a wooden heart painted with the word family. Ethan Ward was at the stove, a soldier trying to remember how to be a man at peace. His uniform jacket hung on the back of a chair, replaced by flannel shirt and jeans. The scars on his hands caught the morning light, reminders of places too far and too cold. He flipped pancakes with the same focus he once used to load rifles, though a faint smile tugged at his lips when Emily ran to hug him from behind. "Easy, chef's busy," he teased. "You're burning breakfast again," she giggled. Across the room, Laura set the table, her auburn hair glowing in the soft sun. She wore a cream sweater and simple jeans, sleeves pushed to her elbows as she arranged plates. When she glanced at Jack, their eyes met for a second longer than expected. A quiet, wordless exchange that said, "We made it." The meal was simple: pancakes, bacon, and hot chocolate. But to them, it tasted like victory. They ate together, laughter blending with the crackle of the fireplace. Emily told stories about how Ranger saved Christmas and how she planned to teach him to dance. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail thumping lazily against the floor. After breakfast, Ethan pushed his plate aside, clearing his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, "about staying." The room stilled for a moment. Jack looked up. "Staying?" Ethan nodded. "Evergreen feels like home again. Emily deserves that. And I was told about your old K-9 training grounds out back." Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That place hasn't seen use in 10 years. Torn fences, frozen pipes, not much left." Ethan's voice was steady. "Then we fix it, together. I could train new handlers, turn it into a rescue program, give the next generation a place to learn what loyalty looks like." Jack was quiet for a long while. Then, slowly, he smiled, the kind that began in his eyes before it reached his mouth. "You've got the heart for it, soldier." Laura placed her hand on Jack's arm. "It's a good idea," she said softly. "Maybe it's time this town got its heroes back." Outside, the sun grew brighter, scattering gold across the snow. Emily had run to the porch, bundled in her little red coat, holding Ranger's leash. "Come on," she called, her breath rising in white clouds. "Let's play." Jack followed her outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Ranger bounded ahead, his paws kicking up snow, ears perked, tail wagging. Emily threw a small snowball that bounced harmlessly off his back. "He's faster than Santa's reindeer," she shouted, laughing. Jack laughed too, a deep, unrestrained sound that felt like it came from somewhere long buried. Inside, Laura and Ethan cleared the dishes. "You know," she said, looking out the window at Jack and Emily, "he hasn't smiled like that in years." Ethan nodded, drying his hands. "He's got a reason now." They joined the others outside. Laura pulled her scarf tighter as she stepped onto the porch, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You're all going to catch your death out here," she teased. Jack turned to her, snow dusting his hair. "Then you'd have to save us, Doc." "Maybe I already did," she replied, smiling. Later that afternoon, they gathered around the fireplace again. The light through the windows had shifted, warm and golden. Emily sat on the rug with Ranger, the dog's head resting on her lap. She traced shapes in his fur and whispered something only he could hear. Ethan watched quietly, his hand resting on his knee, eyes soft. "He's part of the family now," she said suddenly, looking up. "Forever." Jack nodded. "I think he's been waiting for this his whole life." As dusk settled, Laura took a photograph with an old camera she found in Jack's study. The flash startled Ranger, who barked once before curling back up, making everyone laugh. The picture captured them all: Jack, Ethan, Laura, Emily, and Ranger beneath the Christmas tree, the word family hanging above their heads. Snow still lingered outside, but the first signs of thaw had begun. Drops of water sliding down the eaves, light piercing through clouds. For the first time in years, the old Turner farm didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. Jack looked toward the horizon where the last rays of sun touched the hills. "You know," he said softly, "for a long time, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered." Laura turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you just needed to stop looking backward." He smiled faintly. "Maybe Christmas isn't about what we lost. It's about what we find again." As the evening light faded, Ethan hung the photograph above the mantel. The fire crackled, reflecting in the glass frame. Emily curled up beside Ranger, who shifted to rest his head on her small legs. Jack sat beside Laura, their shoulders touching as the warmth spread through the room. The world outside remained cold, but inside that cabin, love had returned like the first sunlight after a storm. Christmas reminds us that no matter how long we've wandered, love can always find its way home. Jack thought he had lost his purpose. Ethan thought he had lost his family. But grace restored what the world had broken. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of faith, family, and redemption. May God bless you and everyone you love this Christmas and always.